In May 2026, Spirit Airlines shut down overnight, stranding thousands of passengers. Jet fuel prices have nearly doubled since fighting broke out in the Middle East. 6 airlines have already collapsed this year. Analysts say at least 9 more might not survive what's left of 2026. Here's the list. Number 9. Zenith Airlines. This small UK charter carrier flying holidaymakers out of regional airports across England cancelled every single flight starting in early June 2026. The Civil Aviation Authority suspended its air operator certificate shortly after, while an administrative firm tried to figure out whether the company could be restructured or sold off in pieces to a rival operator. All 41 flight crew and office staff lost their jobs in the process, with no severance and barely any warning that it was coming. Zenith never made national headlines the way Spirit did, and most travellers outside the UK have probably never even heard its name. But its collapse followed the exact same script every failing airline on this list has followed. Rising costs, thinning cash reserves, and a regulator that finally ran out of patience with a company that couldn't prove it was solvent. If a tiny operator like this can vanish in a matter of days, the bigger names further down this list should worry you even more, especially since Zenith's fleet was fully booked for summer just weeks before it went under. Number 8. AlpAvia. Down in Slovenia, this charter airline spent years flying tourists across the Adriatic coastline, connecting smaller regional airports to Mediterranean beach destinations, before it permanently shut its doors in March 2026. Regulators pulled its air operator certificate after finding the company could no longer prove it had the money to keep flying safely. There was no dramatic bailout attempt, no last-minute government meeting, no press conference explaining what went wrong. AlpAvia simply stopped, and its aircraft sat grounded on the tarmac outside Ljubljana, while former passengers scrambled to rebook with rival carriers at the last minute, some paying far more for seats than they'd originally budgeted. Small charter airlines like this one already operate on razor-thin margins even in good years, and 2026 has been anything but a good year for anyone flying on tight budgets, especially smaller carriers without the fuel hedges bigger airlines can afford. Number 7. hBird. A Swedish court officially declared this charter airline bankrupt after it lost its air operator certificate at the very end of 2025. Regulators had already grounded its flights months earlier, ruling that hBird could no longer meet the financial standards required to operate safely inside Swedish airspace. By the time the bankruptcy filing became public in 2026, the airline had already been sitting idle on the ground for weeks, its jets parked and unused while lawyers sorted through what was left of the company for creditors. hBird's story is a reminder that in this industry, the official paperwork usually arrives after an airline is already finished, not before it, which means the warning signs are often visible to insiders long before the public ever hears about them. Number 6. Air Caledoni. The flag carrier for New Caledonia in the South Pacific filed for insolvency after weeks of airport protests blocked its flights and drained what little cash reserves it had left. Passengers were stranded on the tarmac in Noumea, while demonstrators shut down access to the terminal, and every single cancelled flight meant lost revenue the airline simply could not afford to lose on top of already rising fuel costs. Court-supervised restructuring is underway now, but with tourism numbers to the islands already sliding and the underlying political unrest far from fully resolved, there's no real guarantee Air Caledoni survives that process in one piece, rather than being broken up and sold for parts. For an island economy that depends heavily on flights connecting it to the outside world, losing its only flag carrier would be a much bigger blow than a single airline going under. Number 5. Magna Cartas. Down in Mexico, passengers were told in 2026 that this low-cost carrier was pausing flights for 2 weeks over what it vaguely called operational problems. That 2-week pause never actually ended. About a month later, Mexican aviation regulators revoked Magna Carta's air operator certificate outright, saying the airline no longer had the financial resources to operate safely, and the company filed for bankruptcy protection inside a Mexico City court soon after that revocation became public. Thousands of travelers who had booked flights out of airports across Mexico were left holding tickets for an airline that, for all practical purposes, no longer existed, with little clarity on refunds for anyone who paid in cash or through a travel agency rather than a credit card. Mexican regulators have hinted the case could take months to resolve, leaving grounded aircraft and unpaid staff in limbo well into the second half of the year. Number 4. Joy Air. Out of Xi'an in China, this regional airline flew a small fleet of Boeing 737s and turboprop aircraft between cities like Tianjin, Harbin, and Changsha. On April 27, 2026, Joy Air cancelled every flight just before the start of peak travel season, which is about the worst possible timing for an airline that depends on summer bookings to survive the rest of the year. It has since filed for bankruptcy protection and entered the early stage of restructuring, with few public details on whether it will reorganize or eventually liquidate. Joy Air had already been losing routes for years to China's expanding high-speed rail network and to bigger state-owned carriers like Air China and China Southern, both of which can absorb losses that a small regional operator simply cannot. The fuel spike simply finished a job that competition had already started years earlier. If you're finding this useful, go ahead and subscribe now because the next 4 names on this list are ones you'll actually recognize. Number 3. airBaltic. Latvia's national airline ended 2025 with only about 11 million euros left in cash, an alarmingly thin cushion for an airline still carrying significant long-term debt. In April 2026, the Latvian parliament had to step in with an emergency €30 million loan just to keep airBaltic flying through its most profitable summer season, with repayment due by the end of August. Fitch Ratings has since warned the airline faces a large funding gap by the end of the year, one it may not be able to close without bringing in a new outside investor. The airline has tried diversifying through a wet lease business and new seasonal routes out of the Canary Islands to offset weak winter demand back home in the Baltics, but analysts remain skeptical. It's enough. Ryanair's Michael O'Leary publicly named airBaltic, alongside its rival Wizz Air, as one of the European carriers most likely to collapse if jet fuel prices stay near $150 a barrel through autumn. Wizz Air pushed back hard and called the claim categorically untrue. airBaltic notably hasn't been nearly as vocal in its own defense. Number 2. JetBlue Airways. Even JetBlue's own founder, David Neeleman, has said publicly that he believes the airline could file for bankruptcy before the year is out. His concern is built on numbers from a JP Morgan analyst who estimated that at $4.50 a gallon for jet fuel, JetBlue could lose $1.3 billion this year alone, a loss significant enough to push its total debt toward $9 billion and its annual interest payments close to $800 million. By late March 2026, JetBlue had already brought in outside financial advisors to quietly explore whether the airline could be sold off to a competitor instead of continuing to operate independently. Neeleman himself admitted he isn't even sure who would want to buy it at this point, even as US regulators signal they're open to more airline mergers after approving Allegiant's takeover of Sun Country earlier in the year. Number 1. American Airlines. Out of every major US carrier, American has had the worst 2026 by nearly every measure that matters. Its stock is down close to 30% for the year, and it's lost over 75% of its value over the past decade alone. Its most recent quarterly earnings missed Wall Street's estimate by more than 50%. Operating income collapsed by nearly 60% compared to the year before, and the company reported negative shareholder equity of $3.7 billion, meaning that on paper, American now owes more than everything it owns is actually worth. A government shutdown that disrupted TSA staffing didn't help either, costing carriers hundreds of millions in lost revenue industry-wide. While Delta posted record free cash flow and United flew a record number of passengers in that same stretch, American just kept falling further behind both of them. Airline analysts increasingly describe American as the one major US carrier that genuinely cannot afford another shock. And in 2026, the shocks simply haven't stopped coming. None of these 9 airlines have grounded their last flight just yet, and a few of them may still find a way to turn things around before the year is out. But if the pattern holding steady since Spirit collapsed back in May tells us anything, at least a few of the names on this list won't still be flying by 2027. Whether the rest make it likely comes down to one thing: how long jet fuel prices stay this high and whether the conflict driving them up finally cools off. Subscribe if you want to find out exactly which ones make it,